What was the scariest moment for you in your story where you felt like things were out of control and you had to like get a grip on your mind?
Yeah, so it's so powerful. So my book, Shadow Cell, when I was going through the process of writing it, it was like this weird sort of cathartic healing exercise where I had to revisit my years at CIA mentally, and then I had to revisit the feelings and the emotions and the highs and the lows and all that stuff. And I put those in the book, but I had to relive those personally along the way. So that's why I really appreciate this question because the most scary, the most harrowing, the most uncertain point was when I identified that I was under surveillance in an aggressive, hostile country and I was undercover as a CIA officer. So, what nobody talks about in the movies is that you train for events like this and you prepare for events like this. And in the back of your mind, there's like this little kernel of confidence where you're like, oh, I can't wait to use this in the field. I can't wait to actually detect my surveillance. I can't wait till I'm, tip of the spear. But when that moment actually happens, you realize that that confidence is really just a tiny kernel way in the back of your brain. And everything else is so much louder. The worry, the fear, the doubt, the idea that you'll never see your wife again, the idea that you'll never see your kids, the idea that you may never see your own homeland again. Those are all the things that crowded my mind in that moment where I confidently identified I'm under surveillance.
And let's walk it back a little bit. Like I know you were essentially your unit was brought in to identify a mole from an adversary of the U.S. And that's what led up to that moment you just described. But like, how did you maintain like your composure when you're in like the an enemy's territory to not like give away who you were, and how did you live the day to day life without being in so much fear, like minute by minute? Like, walk the audience through that.
Absolutely. So, one of the first things that CIA teaches its field officers to do is identify risks and then calm your own central nervous system. We all have a sympathetic response to outside stress, and the sympathetic response actually has four different responses. Most people only remember the first two, fight or flight. We all understand that when you're faced with a threat, you either want to run or you want to fight. But there's actually two other responses. One is called freeze, and one is called feign. So when you freeze, it means that you really don't take any action at all. You don't know what to do. Everything just kind of stops. And for anybody who knows what it's like to freeze in a moment of stress, then you understand that sympathetic response very well. The last one, which is feign, that's you actually start to, or fawn, excuse me, you actually start to try to appease your threat. You try to calm them, you try to soothe them, you try to make them show affection towards you, right? Anytime you've seen a child who gets in trouble and then right away they try to give you a hug, or they immediately beg for forgiveness and they want your approval again, that is a fawning action. So your fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, these four sympathetic responses all happen in your body. CIA teaches us that three of those four responses will almost immediately get you killed. If you try to fight, if you try to run, or if you freeze, you're almost certainly dead. You've lost all of your opportunity. Only when you train your fawn response do you actually start to disarm your opponent. So, a lot of what CIA teaches us when it comes to self defense, when it comes to surveillance detection, when it comes to neutralizing an enemy, when it comes to winning or building trust, it's all based around the idea of strategically and tactically applying this fawn behavior in your sympathetic response.
And I can imagine that a lot of times people in general, they let fear like dictate their life on a day-to-day basis. Like, how can people like apply what you just shared in their own daily life to be able to train their mind to not be so drawn to living in fear on a day-to-day basis?
It's a great question, and you kind of have the answer in the question itself because you specifically said, how do we train our mind? That is the answer. You have to train your mind. And what does training mean? Training means repetition. Training means practice. Training means something that we call stress inoculation, which means exposing yourself to instances of fear intentionally to inoculate yourself, just like you inoculate yourself against the flu or you inoculate yourself against COVID or whatever else. You can inoculate yourself against fear. When it comes down to it, cognitively, your brain has two hemispheres. Most of us know that. There's a right brain and a left brain. But what most people don't realize is that your left brain and your right brain work at the same time, but they work at different speeds. Your left logical brain works much, much slower than your right creative emotional brain. So what that means is when you or I see something that scares us, let's say we see a snake and it's coiled up and it's reared and it's ready to strike and it's hissing at us. Both sides of our brain see the snake at the same time, but the two hemispheres work at different speed. On your emotional side, it sees the snake and it immediately is like, I'm going to die. I'm so scared. Stay away from snakes. And it sends that impulse into your body and it creates all the that you don't like about being afraid. The cold sweats, the heart racing, the butterflies in your stomach, the tunnel vision, all of that comes from your emotional brain processing the information faster. But your left brain, your logical brain, is also working at the same time. And it's saying to itself, what kind of snake is it? How big is the snake? Does the snake even have teeth? Have I seen this snake before? And it's your left brain that ultimately lands on the conclusion, oh, that's just a garter snake. And that garter snake isn't going to kill me. It isn't going to hurt me. And for anybody who's had the instance where you immediately startle and then you realize what scared you and you calm down right away, you have felt that response where your left brain works slower than your right brain and ultimately your logic takes over. So the only way that you can speed your left brain up and slow your right brain down so that you can control your fear. Sorry for the long answer here, Doug. But the only way you can do that is through practice and repetition and training. Go do the things that make you scared. Go stand on the high diving board time after time after time until your logical brain says it's really not that far. It's only 10 meters. And your creative emotional brain has a chance to calm down and say, yeah, maybe you're right. Like 10 meters won't kill me. I've watched 100 people dive off of this diving board.
So you referenced at the beginning, that the scariest moment of your life essentially was when you realized that you were being tracked and that people kind of had an idea that you were there to do the thing that you were there to do, right? What did you do like immediately in that moment? Like walk the audience through, like you figure out you're being tracked. You're like, oh my gosh, my life is at risk. Like how did you in that moment calm yourself down and make that move to get yourself into a place of safety?
Absolutely. To be very kind of humiliatingly honest, the first feeling you have is joy because you're like, oh, I can see my surveillance team. It worked, right? My training worked. My experience worked. And I'm catching them. I know I'm under surveillance. And then you give yourself like an internal high five. But then right on the heels of that internal high five where you realize where you're patting yourself on the back for how good you are, right on the back of that, you realize, holy shit, I'm under surveillance. They have every advantage over me. They're watching me. I don't even know how many of them there are. I don't know if there are drones. I don't know if they're tracking my phone. I don't know if they're waiting for me at my hotel. I don't know if there's a van right around the corner that's going to scoop me up. And that's when the panic starts to set in. And in that moment, when you feel your heart rate creep up or jump up and you feel your emotional brain take over, that's where the training sets in. And the training teaches you, I'm getting out of control. My heart rate is increasing. I can feel the sweat on my face. This is going to show I'm going to start shaking and walking fast. I'm going to start to give signs that I'm aware of the surveillance team following me. So you have to start calming those things down. So the first thing that I did after patting myself on the back and realizing that I was then scared immediately afterwards is I started trying to slow my heart rate. Your heart is the key to everything in your body. And if you think about it, it makes total sense. When your heart rate increases, it increases your blood pressure. It increases your body temperature. It increases the amount of oxygen that gets to your brain because blood carries oxygen to the brain. So now your brain goes into like a hyper alert mode. And that hyper awareness really just makes you that much more attuned to what's causing you the stress. Anybody who has anxiety knows exactly what this feels like. You're spooked or you're startled or you're worried about something, and then you get fixated on that thing because your brain becomes hyper aware, hyper attentive, hyper engaged in the thing that's causing you fear. The trick to neutralizing all of that is just to lower your heart rate. So the CIA trained us to lower our heart rate through a breathing technique called box breathing. It also trained us to lower our heart rate through a mental exercise of absolutism. So you're kind of creating a false dichotomy that makes it so that you're not worried about all the what ifs. There's really only two what ifs that matter. What if I succeed? What if I fail? Everything else is just artificial stress. So I start box breathing to lower my heart rate. As I lower my heart rate, I run myself through this false dichotomy. As I go through the false dichotomy, I land on the fact that I really have no other option except to continue to execute fawning behavior in my surveillance detection route like I was trained. And from that moment forward, once you have a decision, every step you get calmer. Every mile that you cover, you understand that much more about your enemy. And even though you can't predict the future, you can predict the present. And at that exact moment, you're not currently being arrested.
What was really interesting to me is like, in your situation, you were going after people that had some like similarities as far as how you were trained, right? And when you're nervous or you're anxious, I know for me, like if I'm like in an important meeting, sometimes my speech will be different because I'm just like, all right, I don't want to say like the wrong thing that's not going to get me the result that I want, right? Like, how did you like stay like calm when talking to people when you knew like in the back of your mind you could say the wrong thing, your tone could be off, and that could be it for you?
A lot of it comes down to preparation. I can't overstate the value of training. Doug, I believe in training so much that when I left CIA, I created a training company, right? Training is what changed my life at CIA. Training is what changed my future of success as a business owner versus a government employee. Training has changed everything from my physical body to my cognition. So I very much believe and value training because of what CIA showed me. And when you train and prepare for whether it's a board meeting or whether it's an interrogation or whether it's an asset uh, briefing in the field, you are the one in control of 90% of what could happen because you're prepared for it. You're prepared for almost everything except for the emergency situation where there's an earthquake that hits your chair meeting, right? Otherwise, anything short of an earthquake, you're ready for it because you've rehearsed it. You've rehearsed them arguing with you. You've rehearsed them saying yes too fast. You've rehearsed, somebody skipping the meeting. You've played it all so many times that by the time you show up, the game is already yours.
And I think that like so many people are like just worried that we're being like tracked. Like people are afraid of like texting certain things on our phone or keeping certain things. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm just being tracked or targeted. Like I heard you in a recent podcast say like most of that's just not true. Like the average person is not being tracked like we think we are. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, and I want to be very specific here. You 100% are being tracked. Every person is being tracked, but you're not being tracked by the government. You're being tracked by a commercial entity or a platform or a cell phone provider or a digital interface that you voluntarily carry in your pocket. Your phone knows everything about you, and it's in your phone's best interest to record everything you do. Every time you navigate to a certain location, every time you do a search for a new Japanese restaurant, every time you send a text message to your wife, it wants to track those things. It wants to track whenever a notification comes in from your wife that you got a text message, or it wants to track how often you use your calendar app versus your Google app, right? So make no mistake, you are tracked all the time. When you're being targeted is different than being tracked because tracking is something that's done as cheaply as possible at scale. Targeting is something that's done to very few people when you dedicate a lot of resources. So, just as a real quick example, imagine somebody who's an actual criminal is using Google Maps to go from one restaurant to another restaurant to a coffee shop to a shoe store on Monday. So no criminal activity at all. They're just navigating around their neighborhood or they're part of the city. That's what they're doing on Monday. On Tuesday, they commit a crime. On Wednesday, their cell phone gets associated with the crime somehow, and now the law enforcement targets that cell phone. Well, once law enforcement targets that cell phone, it can go back through all the data that the cell phone carrier has collected already. So they reach out to Sprint and Verizon and Google, and they say, hey, this phone number is associated with criminal activity. We need everything you have on this phone number. And now, because the criminal spent Monday shopping for shoes and buying coffee, the law enforcement team can identify what neighborhood they probably live in. And if they have home as one of their nav points on their operating system, now they don't even need to look for the person's house. Law enforcement knows the criminal associated with this phone lives at this address. And the investigation gets cut short because they can go straight to the house and they can arrest you and they can bring you in and they can interrogate you. That's what happens when you're targeted. Nobody should worry about being tracked. It sucks, but you actually get a lot of convenience and security from being tracked. And if you get targeted, there is all that you can do about it. You're f***ed if you're targeted because they have more resources, more time, and a stronger dedication to finding you than you have to going without being caught.
Would somebody have to do something pretty like dramatically bad to be tracked by the government?
To be targeted by the government.
Yeah.
I want to use these words very specifically, right? And yes, you essentially have to prove to be a threat to society, whether that's a criminal threat or an intelligence threat or an extremist threat. You have to be pretty significant. Now, don't get me wrong, we are starting to move into an age where just simply opposing your government can make you a target. We have to accept that, whether you like it or not, whether you're pro-Trump or not. We are moving into an age where disagreeing with the government on its own kind of makes you a target sometimes. The same rules apply. Once you are targeted, you can't hide.
One of the things I really found fascinating about your book was you pointed out when you were being followed, like talking about surveillance, that it was a good thing essentially if it was the same person showing up, right? Like you knew that like there wasn't going to be anything like going dramatically wrong in that moment because they were just having somebody follow you. You knew that when it was like bad is when they sent like different people like to check you out and stuff. Like walk the audience through that narrative of being surveilled and why it was like a good thing to see the same person.
So when you're trained in detecting surveillance, and I want to compare this to the average person who's worried about a stalker. So it's the closest thing that I think we have in the normal everyday world is when someone that we don't like is following us. You know, an ex-boyfriend, an ex-wife, the brother of a girlfriend that we hurt or something, or some friend of somebody who we beat up in high school, whatever. When someone is stalking you, essentially it's one person, and that one person has to follow you because they don't have anybody else helping them. So when you see that one face over and over again, it becomes very confident to you who the problem is. And that's important because if you know who the problem is, you can report the problem. You can report it to the principal. You can report it to your boyfriend or girlfriend. You can report it to the cops, whatever. So seeing the same face over and over again is a good thing because it builds your confidence and it builds your ability to describe that face in great detail. When you're part of an operation where there's a team of people following you, that team of people are trained to stay far enough away that you can never really see their face. So we rely on something that we call a profile. And a profile is how you describe a person without using their face. So just take a second to imagine your dad. Now take your dad's face away from him. How would you describe your dad? That is his profile. You might say, oh, my dad's about 6'2", 190 pounds. He's balding or he's got gray hair, but only on the sides. He wears a goatee. He likes baggy clothes. He always wears cowboy boots. What you're describing is a profile. So when you're being professionally tailed, you're identifying people based on a profile. The problem is that professional surveillance change their profile over time. They change out a thin jacket for a thick jacket, ball cap for no cap, sunglasses are on, sunglasses are off. They know how to change their profile so they can blend in even better. But when you start to see those changing faces, that's scarier because you can't describe who the person is. You don't actually know who the threat is. You only know that the threat is there and that the threat is real. So it's tough because who are you going to tell? Even if you try to report it to the police, if you try to report it to your friends, what are you going to say? You're going to say something stupid like there was a guy following me, and they're going to say describe the guy, and you're going to be like I can't. He was big. You've seen this in the comedy movies, right? Where they're like, "Oh yeah, it was a big guy and it was dark outside." Nobody's going to take you seriously, and that can be scary.
One of the things that trips people up is the fear of failure and like letting failure dictate how they're going to live the rest of their life. I know like early in your career in CIA, you had a massive failure and that could have made or break you, right? And I think you were able to use that to your advantage. Talk about how you like essentially erased your fear of failure.
Yeah, it's a big part of my book Shadow Cell, and a big part of my own healing process in writing the book was being able to kind of expose or share my massive failure with the whole world, especially after spending so much time as kind of a media personality. Nobody ever asks you about your failure on camera. So I wanted to write a book about it and make sure people understood front and center that my success all started from failure first. And I wouldn't necessarily say that I erased my fear of failure. I would say that I kind of shifted how I view failure away from it being a negative and towards it being a positive. And that's how CIA views a lot of challenges. CIA is an agency of last resort, which means by the time somebody tasks CIA with an operation, everybody else that's been tasked with that operation has already failed. The military has failed, FBI has failed, the local law enforcement has failed, NSA has failed. Nobody can do the job. So they give it to CIA as a last resort. For that reason, 90% of what CIA does doesn't work. The vast majority of CIA operations actually fail. So we have to be able to forgive ourselves and learn from our failures because we were basically built to fail. That's not different from the average human being. Whether we want to admit it or not, every one of us was built to fail. How did we learn how to walk? By falling a lot. How did we learn how to ride our bikes? By skinning our knees and skinning our elbows. We learned how to type by doing it slowly. We learned how to spell by making typos. We've all learned through failure. And yet, for some reason, socially, our society programs us to think that failure equals bad instead of failure equals good. So when I went to CIA and went through my field tradecraft course, where I learned how to be an overseas intelligence officer, when I went through that course, I passed all the academics, but I failed the panel interview. The panel had to vote for me to be awarded the certificate to operate. And they decided in a split decision that I didn't qualify. So in the eyes of CIA, I did not get my certification. In the eyes of CIA, I failed. In my own eyes, I failed massively. But what ended up happening was because I was fully trained and fully academically qualified for field operations, I ended up being a huge benefit in terrorist operations and proliferation operations and narcotics operations all around the world because I was somebody who could do the job without having to compete against other people for the career promotion. So it ended up being this incredible opportunity that led to me being assigned the Shadow Cell operation.
And what was like the biggest mistake you think you made during that panel interview that led to you being cut?
It's easy, without a doubt. The biggest mistake I made is that when people told me I did something wrong, I defended myself. Without a doubt, that was my biggest error. And for all the argumentative people out there who will die on a cross defending themselves, take it from me, just shut the fuck up. Nobody cares about your defense. Once somebody accuses you of something, whether they accuse you of being rude, or they accuse you of being selfish, or they accuse you of cutting corners, or they accuse you of not being serious, once they accuse you, the story in their brain is over. You cannot convince them otherwise. The best thing you can do is to simply acknowledge what they have told you and promise that you will learn from it. The people who succeed at CIA don't succeed because they're perfect. There were people who got certified by the panel who performed worse than I did throughout all of FTC training. The difference was when an instructor went up to them and said, "Hey, you fucked this up," that person said, "I did. I'll work on it. I'll get better next time." Whereas when an instructor came up to me and said, Andy, you fucked this up, I'd be like, no, no, no. Let me explain what I was thinking. Let me tell you why I did that. Let me show you how smart I am. At the end of the day, nobody wants to work with a person like that. So my biggest mistake at the farm was by far defending myself and having an ego that made me feel like I had to explain my intentions when I should have just agreed with everybody else's criticism and had my own internal mechanism for not letting it weigh me down.
Do you think at the root of that comes back? It comes back to what we're talking about now. Is like you had this fear of failure, that they would see you as a failure if you didn't admit you were wrong.
And you would be labeled as a failure, right? I mean, what is a grade point average in school? It's a number, a numerical empirical value that shows how much you have failed. Have you failed just a little bit and you're a 3.8, or have you failed a lot and you're a 1.5? It's not a label for success. Nobody celebrates having a 3.2. You either have a 4.0 or you suck. That's basically how it works, right? So society labels us and society gives us this fake index that we have to run through where everything is either a complete success or graduated failure. And some people just fail less and some people fail more. So without a doubt, there was this element of that carryover where I didn't want to admit error because admitting error is admitting failure. And I didn't want to admit failure because people who get hired by CIA can't be failures.
I know that story of failure kind of haunted you throughout your career. Talk about how that would come up and how you managed that so that it wouldn't overtake what you were trying to accomplish.
One of the things that people don't realize about CIA is it's still a career. So all the bureaucratic nonsense, all the political infighting, all the favoritism and nepotism that you see in your everyday life, whether it's a small business or a big corporation, whether it's an academic setting, whether it's an investment setting, all the stuff that pisses you off about having to play the game inside your job 100% exists inside CIA also. It's still a game of metrics and friends. It's still about who you know and what opportunities you're given. It's still about hitting certain key performance indicators so that you can qualify for promotion. So when I failed the farm and went into the general CIA pool of talent, I was constantly kind of haunted by this idea that I had already failed the big bad, you know, uh, jet pilot version of CIA. So now, whenever anybody else looks at me, they're just going to look at me as the guy who washed out. They're just going to look at me as the guy who failed. So that put a gravitas on me that made me kind of uncaring and insensitive to the operations and to the mission. I was just doing a job. I was just punching in and punching out. And the fact that I had some things that I was skilled at, and the fact that I built a reputation that people liked in some parts of the agency was kind of lost on me because I was just trying to get through the day. It wasn't until much later in my agency career when I really realized that failure from the farm was a huge blessing. Only after that did I start leaning into my job again and start leaning into working extra hours and taking extra risks and really caring about the mission. So for a solid 3 years, I was at the agency just going through the motions, and it's a hard place to be.
But there were times like throughout your journey where I feel like you were on the slippery slope of like self-sabotage, right? Like even when you thought you were being caught, the story in your mind was already going to like what they were going to do to you, even though like that wasn't happening and it in fact didn't happen. Like how do you think people can prevent like that gap between like failing and then completely like destroying their life with self-sabotage because they're convinced their life is going to go a different direction?
Yeah, self-sabotage is a very real thing. And it's heavily tied to what we discussed earlier, Doug, with the idea of the left brain and the right brain moving at different speeds. When we let our brains tell us a story, we have to understand that that story is a creative endeavor. So the fact that you're telling yourself a story means it's coming from the creative part of your brain, not the logical part of your brain. So you have to start to test the two different sides of your brain. Let me just give you kind of a silly example, right? Um, I went to a music festival recently, a 3-day music festival. And when I was at the festival, this cute little 20 something girl, she recognized me from YouTube. And she came up to me, and she didn't come like excitedly running up to me or anything like that. She just came up to me and she was like, "Excuse me, are you Andrew Bustamante? I think I've seen you on YouTube." And that turned into like a conversation for maybe 30 minutes or so about how she saw me on YouTube and her interest in psychology and human behavior and whatever, whatever, whatever. Anybody who's talked to a girl in their mid 20s, it's kind of empty and shallow conversation about her interests. That's basically what the conversation was for about 30 minutes. Well, that was the first day of a 3-day festival. So every day of the festival, I would see her and we'd have another conversation for another 30 minutes or an hour. And we might have 2 or 5 or 10 conversations over the course of the 3 days. Well, by the end of the first full day, I'm sitting there and we're talking so often and so much that I'm wondering if this girl is flirting with me. And I'm like, is this young girl really flirting with my old 45-year-old? Because that would be really awkward. And not only that, I'm married. I have no idea how to flirt back. So if I'm like, maybe I'm making an out of myself and not even realizing it. Well, then I reflected on that and I started saying, okay, let's do that false dichotomy. There's 2 options here. Either she is flirting or she isn't flirting. There is no other what if that matters. So if she's flirting, then what objective things would I see? Well, I would see smiles, and I would probably see touching, and I would certainly see, flipping of the hair and putting on cute outfits. Like I would see other indications of flirtatious behavior. I'm not seeing those things. Therefore, I have to give up on the idea that she's flirting and focus instead on the fact that she's really just interested. She's not flirting. She's just interested in whatever, a job, a network connection, who knows what. Well, once I objectively kind of walked myself through what is evidence of success and what is evidence of failure here, that's when I saw that this is just a curious 20-something who's got their own ideas and their own interests and whatever else. Especially when I saw her actively flirting with other people, and I was like, "Oh, this is definitely a normal person." The reason I bring up this story is because when we self-sabotage, we usually self-sabotage by telling ourselves a story that isn't there. We tell ourselves our boss hates us. We tell ourselves there's a coworker working against us. We tell ourselves there's no way the bank would ever approve our loan. We have to recognize that that's just a story. You have to test that story against objective facts and then follow what the facts tell you. If you have a good credit rating, the bank might say yes. If you have, if you're just not talking to your boss, then of course you're going to feel like your boss doesn't like you. It just goes on and on.
What have you found to be like the most effective like way to kind of like hack your brain or your mind when you're like in that spiral of self-sabotage to help you feel confident again?
You have to ground yourself to objective facts. When you feel like you're panicking and when you feel yourself spiraling out of control, the most important step to interrupt that cycle is to label it what it is. And to label it, I am spiraling out of control. I am getting emotional. You have to call it what it is. If you don't call it what it is, all you're doing is feeding the spiral. So you can't sit there and worry about, what happens if my house catches on fire and then start wondering, well, what if it starts from the toaster? And what if it starts from somebody or the broken water heater? Or what if my kids didn't unplug their lamp? Whatever it might be, you've got to realize the fact that I'm even thinking this question right now shows that I'm paranoid. This is not normal. There's no reason for me to think that this is going to happen. Let's look at the facts. And once you start looking at the facts, you're basically taking your attention off of the emotion and you're putting your attention onto the facts. And that very simple shift of your intentions and your attention, that very simple shift immediately starts to slow down that right side of the brain.
I look at my own life and talking about failure and like I had 21 jobs by the time I was 21. I was incarcerated on felony drug charges. And in my mind, I was convinced that I was a failure because on paper it was. Like you talked about the GPA, you talked about like being judged at CIA. Because the fact was like I was like I couldn't keep a job. My relationship sucked. I was a drug addict. I'm in jail. But then it's like I'm trying to think of myself as not a failure, but yet it was so hard because up until that point in my life, I had proven to myself that I couldn't really like accomplish like anything. Like I was fortunate to be in jail and have a guy who was my cellmate get me into fitness, and that got me on this jumpstart the transformation. But a lot of people don't have the good fortune of having like a mentor like that in a very vulnerable when you're in a very like kind of vulnerable state. Like what is your advice to someone who has continued to like quote unquote fail over the years and their brain is just wired because of their actions and their behaviors to think that no matter what they do, they're not going to succeed?
CIA teaches us that there is a natural talent in every person. And that natural talent doesn't mean that you're the best in the world at something. It just means that there are certain things that you can naturally do that will help build positive momentum. And the idea of momentum is really important at CIA because momentum is what replaces motivation. It's what replaces ambition. It's what replaces drive because momentum is automatic. So when you describe, Doug, that somebody introduced you to fitness and that was the jump start on your road to transformation, what you're talking about is momentum. You didn't even have to try to get excited for working out most of the time. It was just easy. It was fun. It was relaxing. It was liberating. It was enjoyable. It was distracting. There are always days that you have to get yourself pumped up for leg day. But generally speaking, the rest of it was kosher. It was easy. We all have a natural talent like that. For some people, it's writing. For some people, it's being on camera. For some people, it's creating videos. For some people, it's painting. For some people, it's walking dogs or training dogs or mowing grass. You name it. Everybody has some natural talent that builds momentum. What CIA does for its field officers is during our training process, it finds that momentum builder for us. And then it helps us leverage that momentum to do other great things. When you're dealing with repetitive failure in the field, right? When an average, typical, everyday person is failing or feels like they have a reputation of being a failure, all that really means is you have not yet found your source of momentum. You have found all these other things that are not your source of momentum. A 9 to 5 job, not your source of momentum, right? Having to file taxes, not a source of momentum. Having to wake up at 6 a.m., not a source of momentum, right? You have a huge list of things that don't work for you, which means that you're getting closer and closer to finding the thing that really will be your source of momentum. One of my favorite types of people to talk to, Doug, are criminals, ex-cons, because when somebody gets into crime, it's almost always because they found that some element of that criminal activity was natural to them. The lying, the hiding, the late nights, the convincing other people to join you, some part of it was natural to them. And it was so easy that they became criminals without even really realizing it. So I'm curious if that's something that resonates with you.
It does because I think like growing up it was just kind of normal for me to numb the pain and to hide my emotions and to hide my feelings, and I was able to do that with drugs. And the other thing too for me was I had this need to be loved that I didn't feel like I got as much when I was younger, and because of that I chased after selling drugs to be able to feel wanted and needing. So I kind of all comes back, right, to these innate desires that I had. And I think eventually I just had convinced myself that what I was doing was okay. And in order to protect my ego and my story, I had to like manipulate other people and lie to them and convince them that like whatever I was doing was the right thing.
And you built that momentum from what you said, it came easy to you, right? It was natural.
It was very natural for me and easy because I was somebody that I liked numbing the pain, and that momentum, like the same type of momentum you build in a positive direction, also goes in the negative direction too. And for me, those things just became easy. It became easy to like falsely charm people and get people to like me because that's what I needed. I needed to get people to like me. So in order to do so, I did some of the things that I did when I was younger.
And it's fascinating because, people don't connect the dots here, but what you're talking about are all creative endeavors. Creative means right brain endeavors. When you're trying to be charming, when you're trying to get people to like you, when you're trying to persuade others to trust you, all of those are creative efforts, just like painting a picture or cooking a meal or, changing the lighting in your studio. Those are all creative endeavors. And it's really important to understand that because we live in a society that does not value creative effort. We live in a society that values STEM, that values science and technology and engineering and math, all these logical left brain activities. But those left brain activities are not what actually creates momentum for you. Nobody builds momentum by solving 7 math problems correctly in a row. We build momentum because we're proud of ourselves for understanding the math problems, and then we're excited to try new problems. That's all creative energy, not logical energy.
And speaking of being like creative, it seemed like from reading the book, and again, like I don't know the full time frame. I'm sure some of it was just condensed for the purpose of the book, but it seemed like you got that mission done rather quickly. Where I was reading, I was like, man, this would take me like 2 decades to like figure this all out and connect all the dots and the missing pieces. And I imagine like CIA teaches you to be like hyper efficient. Um, like how can the average person like take that as far as like condensing time so that they can accomplish like a lot in a short amount of time?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just having this conversation recently with somebody who's an author, and it's not that CIA teaches us to be hyper efficient. In fact, it teaches us kind of the opposite, because hyper efficiency means that you're more focused on the process than the outcome. Instead, what CIA teaches us is it teaches us to balance hyper focus and something called hyper awareness. So, two extremes on a spectrum. On one extreme, you are hyper aware, which means you are very cognizant of what's happening around you. And on the other end, you're hyper focused, which means you're so focused on the thing that you're doing that you're utterly blind to what's happening around you. You can really start to see how completely different these things are. Now, what's fascinating is that when you learn how to balance these two, which doesn't mean you do both at the same time, it means you do one or the other. You are either hyper focused or you are hyper aware. When you learn how to do the two, what you find is that activities that are hyper focused build up your energy reserves. So, for people who love to read, when they read for hours on end, they put the book down and they're energized. For people who love to play music, for people who love to cook, for people who love to hang out with their best friend, you can do it for hours, hyper focused. And when you're done, you have energy to last days. Hyper awareness is incredibly energy draining. So when you're sitting at work, pretending like you want to be there, hoping that nobody identifies that you're sleeping at your desk, you just get more and more tired, because that hyper awareness, that worry about what's happening around you all the time. What's that lady thinking? What's that person doing? Is the camera catching me? What time is it? That hyper awareness becomes a very exhausting experience. CIA teaches us you have to do hyper awareness activity. So the only way that you're going to fuel yourself for the hyper awareness is by doing hyper focused activity also. To answer your question, for our book Shadow Cell, that entire operation that we document in the book took place over the course of approximately 2 years. We got an incredible amount of work done in 2 years because of exactly what we're talking about now, Doug. We were hyper aware when we were in a hostile foreign country, and it was exhausting. And then we were hyper focused when we were preparing to go into that country and run our operations. And by bouncing back and forth between hyper awareness and hyper focus, we always maximized our energy reserves, maximized our focus, maximized our success, so that when we got into the country to do the hard work, we had the most results.
So how can like the average person like put that into practice in their day-to-day life?
Let me give you a really funny, simple example, right? Um, One of the best ways to be hyper focused is when you're watching a movie or when you're binging your favorite TV show, which, let's be honest, most people do that naturally. Most people go back to their home, go back to their apartment on the weekends or after work. They lock the front door. They make themselves whatever, a cup of tea, or they crack open a beer, and they'll watch 3 or 4 of their favorite shows. They'll watch 4 hours, 6 hours, 2 hours of television. What they don't realize, though, is that period of time is building up their energy. It's why they get up kind of antsy. It's why they're like, oh, like, I wonder if anybody wants to go out. I have energy to watch another movie, right? That hyper focus is building up your energy. The problem is that in everyday life, people don't direct that energy into something that is energy draining, that is also productive, right? Being hyper aware because you're self conscious at work That's not a good way to use the energy that you saved from watching Netflix the night before. Instead, you should use that hyper awareness to start looking for a new job, start building a new business, actually write the book you've been talking about writing for the last 3 years, right? Do something that is exhausting because it builds up it drains the energy that you've built up from your hyper focus. If you don't like going to the gym, go to the gym, because going to the gym is going to make you very aware of how weak your muscles are and how easily you get fatigued. And then go back home and watch another couple of movies and build your energy back up again, and then go back to the gym again. And if you can go through this process, you're going to have incredible results. But instead, people just they're they're using the energy they save to just make it through a miserable day. There's no future for the person who does that.
Would you say it's the main reason people don't succeed in life and they limit themselves?
100%. That is the reason that there are so few success stories in life. Traveling around the world with the agency and meeting people from all over the world, meeting adversaries and allies alike, it becomes very clear that there is a type of person who succeeds and there is a type of person who doesn't succeed. And the type of person who succeeds is not smart. They're not handsome. They're not dedicated. They're not blessed. They didn't come from money. That's not the stereotype. The stereotype is that the hyper successful person is the person who is always trying to build something that they care about. And it may take them 10 years to build it. It may take them 10 weeks to build it, but they're always trying to build something. The who's never trying to build anything is the person who's destined to fail and be a repetitive failure forever. And they don't even realize that they're the cause of their own turmoil. So whether you're talking about an impoverished Indian, or whether you're talking about somebody who comes from the wrong family name in Brazil, or whether you're talking about some, middle Americana, typical middle-aged man, in all cases, they're focused on the wrong thing. They're not focused on trying to build. They're focused on trying to survive. They're focused on trying to skate by. They're focused on trying to go without creating any waves. And that's not the kind of person who finds success.
We've talked about a lot of different skills that you've learned and acquired at CIA that, have helped you, achieve what you've achieved. What do you think's been the most valuable skill that you've taken from CIA and have applied to what you're doing now?
Absolutely. The most valuable skill that CIA gave me was the ability to look at a situation through the other person's perspective. When you're sitting at a dinner table with your spouse or with a girlfriend or a boyfriend, it's really easy to see the whole scenario from your point of view. You look down and you see the food that you're eating. You know how your stomach feels. You know how your clothes feel on your body. You know if you think the restaurant is hot or cold. You know if you think the background sound is too much or just right. So at CIA, we call all of that your perception. Your perception of the reality that you're in is based on your five senses. The real power comes from being able to put yourself in the shoes of the other person and practice perspective, gaining perspective over the entire situation by looking at it through their lens. Okay, I'm in a button-down long sleeve shirt, but my date is in a dress that's got thin straps. I wonder if she's cold. If she is cold, is that why she's ordering hot tea instead of, a glass of wine? And if she's ordering tea, is that, could that be a sign that she's also tired and she needs the caffeine? You start to gain perspective by asking questions you otherwise would never have asked. Another kind of humiliatingly embarrassing story, Doug, when I was in the Air Force, I've always loved women, always loved going on dates, always loved the challenge of trying to meet a girl, get her number, woo a girl, and impress a girl. It's a stupid thing, but it's something that's always been me. I remember that I was always so confused when I was in the military because I would get all these first dates. I would get all these phone numbers. I would have a bunch of first dates, and then they would never talk to me again. I would never have a second date. I would call, I would text, but I would never win a second date. So for some reason, I thought the dates were going so well, but the feedback that I was clearly getting is that the girl did not think the dates were going so well. It wasn't until CIA taught me this idea of perception and perspective that I could sit back and realize, oh, it's because I'm going on these dates and all I care about is me. All I care about is my meal, my level of comfort. I'm picking the restaurants. I'm picking the music in the car. I'm probably talking about myself more than I'm asking questions about her, right? And of course, it makes sense that since I'm not showing that I care at all about her point of view, I'm not winning her trust or her attention. Now, that applies to all of us every day with our kids, with our coworkers, with our bosses, with our clients. We live in a world of our own perception when we need to live in a world of perspective if we intend to succeed.
Speaking of perception, I think we've talked about like a lot of these like little adversities and how people can tackle them in their lives. But one of the big things is like what happens when like stuff completely goes wrong and the country like shuts down. I know there's a lot of like unrest right now, and people are kind of panicking. People are kind of on the edge of their seats a little bit. I know you kind of have talked about having plans to leave the U.S. Like, what's your overall thoughts on the situation? What can the average person do to protect themselves if like stuff does completely go wrong?
And I don't want to be alarmist by any means, right? My choice to leave the country is just as much personal as it is provocation, right? Yes, I think that the United States is headed for a very difficult decade or so in its future. I think financially and fiscally, we're headed for a challenge. I think when it comes to our geopolitical influence and our geopolitical um, leverage, we are heading for some very dark days. I think that we have shown the world that we don't really care about democracy and we don't really care about equality and we don't really care about all the things that we've been trying to espouse since the end of World War II. I think we've really started to show the world like, hey, we only just care about ourselves. We care about our economy. We care about our security. We care about our people. And all of you other people can kind of go to hell. I don't think there's anything wrong with the direction the United States is going. I just think that the direction that we're going in is going to make life more difficult before it makes life better again. So when I choose to leave the country, it's because I want my children to grow up in a place where they have ample opportunity. In the United States for the next 10 to 15 years, we're not going to have ample opportunity. We're going to be dealing with an environment where foreigners are less pro American, where the dollar has less value, where our goods are less easy to access, where foreign goods are more expensive, like where jobs are less. We're facing difficult times, where universities no longer freely have research grants, where politics bleeds into everything from business to education. That's what we're facing as we decide if that's going to be permanent or just temporary. I want my children to be somewhere else. And when you are an American citizen living abroad, you have incredible opportunities that you don't have when you're an American citizen living inside the United States. So that's why I want to move. That's why I want to leave the country. I want to give my children the most possible opportunity possible. And that's not going to happen if we live inside the continental United States.
There's a lot of people that will say like there's more opportunity than ever with technology and like the use of the phones and stuff. Like what are their blind spots that they're missing that you're seeing for the next decade or so?
That technology does not exist within borders. Technology is border ambivalent. You can go anywhere and have all of those opportunities. So why would you choose to limit your success and limit your opportunities to just what is digitally available to you? You can literally relocate yourself for just the summer. When your kids are out of school, you can relocate yourself to Mexico and you have the opportunity to learn a second language, one of the most widely spoken languages in the world. You have the opportunity to give your children fluency in Spanish just by going to Mexico for a summer. You're never going to get that off of an app that comes up on your phone, right? So that's just one simple example. Let's not even think about what happens when you start investing your US dollars in European fiscal markets. So as the American stock market goes up and down with changes in politics, the European stock market is much more stable. So if you're 70 years old and you're trying to make sure that your fixed income lasts, you probably don't want to be putting it into volatile stocks in the US market. You want to be putting it into something more stable. That there's all sorts of opportunities that people aren't considering if they limit themselves to only thinking about technology. Technology is what we call at CIA an enabler. It enables you to do other things. In and of itself, it is not a solution. It doesn't solve problems by itself. It helps make the solution of certain problems faster, easier, and more efficient. But at the end of the day, all it does is enable. It doesn't solve the problem on its own.
You used to hear like people say, well, you should have like 3 months worth of like food or something if like the world were to come crashing down. Like if you were to give the audience like a toolkit that they could just have a baseline fundamental thing that they're ready if something dramatic were to happen, what would it be?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I will say bold face to anybody out there that if you're going to try to hunker in place during a disaster, you're a fucking fool. And for all the people out there who are trying to teach people how to hunker down in place in the event of an emergency, you are also a fool. It doesn't matter how much food or how many bullets or how much water you've stored. It doesn't matter how much canned goods you have in your basement. If the worst actually happens, your surplus is going to be the thing that makes you a target of everybody else around you. The most powerful toolkit that you can have in the event of a real emergency is mobility. You want to be able to move. We have a concept at CIA and throughout all of elite services, military and otherwise, where we say you have to get off the X. You have to get off the X. Movement is your friend. So why would you have 200 pounds of tuna in your basement? You could have 10 pounds of tuna in a backpack and you could literally move and nobody would ever know where your tuna supply is. So you would be able to stay under the radar. You would not be identified. You would not be targeted. You could move further and faster than anybody else who's trying to shelter in place. So for the toolkit that CIA gave us is really simple. You always want to have laced shoes, always. It sounds silly, but laced shoes make it so that rocks and glass and stones and hot metal don't get into your foot in the immediacy of a disaster. You always want to have a raincoat. Again, it sounds silly, but a raincoat is what keeps the clothes that you're wearing preserved. It keeps them dry. It also keeps the wind off you. It also keeps you insulated against the cold. You always want to have cash and some sort of credit card. So you want to have two options of how you actually carry out a transaction because in a true disaster, cash is going to become king. But before you spend your cash, you're going to want to ride the credit wave as long as you can. You always want to have some sort of ID, preferably an ID that lets you cross international borders. So if you don't have a passport right now, get a fucking passport so that if disaster strikes in the United States, you're literally a plane flight or a border crossing away from Canada or Mexico where the disaster will hopefully be less. If you have a passport, a credit card, cash, laced shoes, and a raincoat, you've got everything you need to survive any disaster better than the person who tries to hide in their basement and shoot all the strangers who come knocking at the door.
Portugal became like this place that everybody wanted to move to a few years ago, and I've
Still
had
is.
people, yeah, I've had friends that lived there and then kind of came back. But like, where are some places that you've had your eye on that have more opportunity than the U.S.?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of places that have different opportunities. I want to make sure that I highlight that. It's not necessarily quantifiable more or less. For me, as a father with two kids that are my kids' ages, that's the lens I look through to quantify what's more or less. But on my short list of places that I look at for my family, I look at Costa Rica, I look at Croatia, I look at Portugal and Spain, just like so many other people. I always look at Switzerland. I look at New Zealand. I look at Australia, and I look at Singapore. I look at all of those countries as countries that are very viable options to rebuild a very stable life in a pro-American environment.
Well, Andy, thank you for coming on and for sharing all of your wisdom and your vulnerability about the book, about your story, and all of your tips. If people want to buy a Shadow Cell, where's the best place to do that?
Absolutely. I mean, you can find Shadow Cell everywhere books are sold. It's on bookshelves right now. It's on Amazon right now. It's on Goodreads, you'll find it if you go to shadowcellbook.com. It's everywhere. It's already hitting bestseller status, Doug. We're blessed and proud to be behind the book. And then of course, I've got links here in the description of this video for anybody who wants to just click on a link and find their way to the book.
Amazing, man. Well, thank you once again. The book is amazing. Highly encourage people to go check it out.